In January of 1966, a photographer named Tom West posted a series of vintage drag racing photos to a classic car forum, and within hours, the comment section lit up with one question over and over: who is that woman? The picture showed a dark-haired beauty in short shorts and dogo boots, laughing beside top-fuel dragsters at Orange County International Raceway, presenting trophies to drivers whose names are still legendary today, standing in victory lane with confidence that seemed to radiate off the film itself. She appeared in dozens of shots from the early 1970s, always at the center of the action, always smiling, always the most photographed person at some of the biggest drag races in American history. Tom West, the photographer, told them her name: Barbara Roufs, Trophy Queen, PDA Queen, one of the most recognized women in Southern California drag racing during its golden age. And then something happened that West wasn't expecting. A woman showed up in the comments identifying herself as Barbara's daughter. She thanked West for posting the photos. She said her mother would have been proud to see them because they showed her best moments in life and her happiest days. She said her mother had lived a happy and exciting life that was short-lived. And then she confirmed something that nobody in the drag racing community had ever known. Barbara Roufs had died by suicide on January 25, 1991, at the age of 47 in Fresno, California, roughly 15 years after the spotlight that once defined her had gone dark. Her death was not reported in newspapers. No racing publication ran an obituary. The drag racing world she had once adorned simply did not notice her leaving it. The photographs West posted showed a woman at the absolute peak of visibility in a subculture that worshipped speed and spectacle. But between the last time she stood in front of a camera at a drag strip and the day she died, there exists an almost complete evidentiary void. No interviews, no articles, no public record beyond vital statistics, just silence. And what her daughter said about those photographs carries a weight that requires no interpretation. The happiest days were the ones on camera. What came after we know only by how it ended. This is the story of Barbara Roufs and the machinery that made her famous, and the dark cost of a particular kind of celebrity that burned bright for a few years and left nothing behind but images. Barbara Jean Brown was born July 22, 1943, in Clovis, California, a small city in Fresno County, about 200 miles north of Los Angeles. She was not from the Southern California beach culture that most people associate with hot rodding and drag racing. She was a Central Valley girl. Her father, Wayne Eldon Riley, was a motorcycle racer at the Kearney Bow, a dirt track venue in Fresno County. Her mother, Thelma Ruby Riley, ran a beauty salon in Clovis for nearly 50 years and played organ at 4 different churches. Wayne and Thelma would later become the first husband and wife team inducted into the Clovis Hall of Fame, which tells you something about how embedded this family was in the local motorsports community. Barbara had 3 biological siblings, Vivian, James, and Bruce, plus an adopted brother, Ben Gube. The family surname history reveals some complexity here. Genealogical records list Barbara's birth name as Brown, and her mother did not marry Wayne Riley until 1947, 4 years after Barbara's birth. Whether Brown was Thelma's maiden name or a prior married name is unclear, but the children grew up under the Riley name. What matters is this: Barbara grew up in a household where motorsport was not abstract. Her father raced, her mother rode motorcycles alongside him. The culture of speed was woven into family life from the beginning. This was not a girl who stumbled into car culture as an outsider. She was born into it. She married Donald Arthur Roufs around 1961 when she was about 18 years old and had a daughter, Bridget, in 1964. They divorced in 1971. There is some reference in genealogical databases to a possible earlier brief marriage to a man named Bill Eugene Fulton in Nevada in 1961, but this remains unconfirmed by any second source. What we know for certain is that by her late 20s, Barbara was a divorced mother living in California during the height of the sexual revolution and the explosion of West Coast car culture. The timing here matters. By 1970, she was 27 years old, recently divorced, raising a daughter on her own, and looking for a way to be part of something bigger than the life she had in front of her.
Now, to understand what happened to Barbara Roufs, you have to understand what drag racing was in Southern California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. This was not the corporate, sanitized, NHRA-dominated sport that exists today. This was the Wild West. Southern California had more drag strips than anywhere else in America, and they were packed every single weekend. Lyons in Wilmington, known as the Beach, Orange County International Raceway in Irvine, Irwindale, San Fernando, Ontario, Fontana, San Gabriel, Paradise Mesa, Riverside, Goleta, Colton, Ramona, Santa Ana. These were not just racetracks, they were cultural epicenters where the unkempt youth culture would gather shoulder to shoulder to watch blown big block gassers bouncing in tandem, followed by thundering funny cars drowning out calliope music piped through tinny PA speakers. The smell of nitromethane hung in the air like incense. The sound was so loud it rattled your chest cavity, and the crowds were enormous. On a good Saturday night at Lyons, you might have 10,000 people crammed into the grandstands and spilling onto the hills overlooking the track. At OCIR, the crowds were even bigger because the facility was newer and had actual permanent seating. This was before cable television, before ESPN, before the internet. If you wanted to see top fuel dragsters running 5-second passes in Burson, this is where you went. And the culture around it was intoxicating. The racers were celebrities in a way that is hard to understand today. Don Prudhomme was the snake. Tom McEwen was the mongoose. Jungle Jim Lieberman showed up in a Corvette with his girlfriend in a bikini. Shirley Muldowney was proving women could drive top fuel as well as any man. These people were lifelong, and the tracks where they raced felt like the center of the universe. At the center of this spectacle, both literally and visually, were the trophy girls. These were young women hired by sponsors, manufacturers, and track promoters to present awards, pose for photographs, represent brands, and add what the industry bluntly called cheesecake to the events. An earlier generation called them pit popsies. They were, by design, decorative. The role had evolved considerably through the 1960s. Early trophy queens wore evening gowns and tiaras like beauty pageant contestants. They stood on stages, they waved, they handed out trophies at formal ceremonies. By the time Barbara entered the scene, the uniform had shifted to short shorts, tank tops, go-go boots, and flowing hair. This was the look of the sexual revolution grafted onto motorsports. At a Saturday night race at OCIR, you would see dozens of these women moving through the pits and standing in victory lane and climbing onto the hoods of race cars for photo opportunities that were as carefully choreographed as anything Hollywood produced. But here is what the role actually entailed, beyond just looking pretty. Trophy girls were expected to be available all day at the track, from early morning tech inspection through final eliminations, which could run until midnight or later. They stood in the sun for hours. They posed for hundreds of photographs with fans and racers. They presented trophies, which sounds simple, but at a big PDA event, you might be handing out awards for dozens of different classes and brackets and specialty races. You were representing sponsors, which meant you had to know which products you were promoting and be able to talk to them intelligently to press photographers. You had to navigate the politics of the pits because every racer wanted their picture taken with you and every sponsor wanted you visible with their car. And you had to do all of this while maintaining the look they hired you for, which meant perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect outfit in 100-degree heat while standing on hot asphalt, breathing nitromethane fumes.
The job paid almost nothing. Maybe $50 for a weekend event. Maybe $100 if it was a major race. Some girls did it for free, just for the access and the excitement. The real compensation was supposed to be the visibility and the lifestyle. You got to be at the center of this incredible scene. You got to party with racers, you got your picture in magazines, you got recognized at the track. For a few years, you got to feel famous. Barbara Roufs entered this world in the late 1960s. How exactly she got into it is not documented, but the path was not complicated. You showed up at a track, you talked to a promoter or a sponsor rep. If you had the look they wanted, you got the job. And Barbara had the look. But more than that, she had something else. She was in her late 20s when she became prominent, which was unusual. Most trophy girls entered the scene in their late teens or early 20s. They were 19, 20, 21. Barbara was pushing 30, which in this world might as well have been ancient. But she carried herself with a confidence that stood out even in a crowd of beautiful women. She looked comfortable. She looked like she belonged there, and that made all the difference.
She became a regular presence at Orange County International Raceway, and that matters because OCIR was the crown jewel of California drag racing. Let me paint the picture of what OCIR was. This facility opened in 1967 on a piece of land in Irvine that the Irvine Company was developing into what would eventually become a massive commercial zone. The track cost over $1 million to build, which in 1967 money was an absolutely staggering amount for a drag strip. It had permanent concrete grandstands that could seat thousands. It had a 40-foot glass timing tower that looked like something out of a science fiction movie. It had an electric scoreboard. It had a fully paved pit area, which sounds basic now, but back then most drag strips were just dirt lots with gravel pits. It had lighting for night racing. It had concessions and restrooms that actually worked. This was a professional facility built to professional standards, and it immediately became the place where you wanted to race if you were anybody in the sport. OCIR attracted the best racers in the country. Don Prudhomme raced there regularly, Tom McEwen, Don Garlitz when he came out west, Shirley Muldowney. Every major name in drag racing came through OCIR because the facility was that good, and the crowds were that big, and the purses were competitive. The track also hosted major events that drew national attention, and when they won, Barbara Roufs was often the one handing them the trophy. Around 1972 or 1973, she was crowned Queen of the 6th Annual U.S. Professional Dragster Championship at OCIR. This was a big deal. The event was organized under the Professional Dragster Association, which was an independent racing series founded by fabricator and promoter Doug Cruz. Now, the PDA is important to this story, so let me explain what it was. In the mid-1960s, top fuel racers were getting increasingly frustrated with the purses being offered by establishment racing organizations. These guys were spending thousands of dollars to build and maintain the fastest cars on Earth, and they were racing for prize money that barely covered their fuel costs. Doug Cruz, who was a chassis builder and all-around hustler, saw an opportunity. He organized independent match races with bigger purses, funded by sponsors and gate receipts. The first official PDA race happened in 1967 at Lyons Drag Strip, and it drew 94 top fuel dragsters competing for 64 spots in the field. They ran eliminations until 4 in the morning. The place was packed. The racers loved it because the money was better. The fans loved it because they were seeing the best cars in the country going head-to-head.
By the early 1970s, the PDA had become a major force in West Coast drag racing, and OCIR had become its home base. PDA events at OCIR were spectacles. They would run qualifying on Saturday and eliminations on Sunday, and both days would draw capacity crowds. And part of the spectacle was the crowning of the PDA Queen. This was not just some girl they picked randomly. This was a formal title with a formal crowning ceremony, and the woman who held it was expected to be the face of the organization at every event. She presented trophies to the winners, she posed for promotional photos, she appeared in advertisements. She was as much a part of the PDA brand as the dragsters themselves. In 1973, Barbara Roufs was formally crowned PDA Queen, and her visibility exploded overnight. She was now the official face of one of the biggest racing organizations in the country, and she was working every major event they held. She was photographed constantly by Tom West, whose images of her are now considered iconic documents of the era. Tom West was a fixture at Southern California drag strips through the 1960s and 70s, and his camera captured everything. He shot the cars, he shot the crashes, he shot the fans, he shot the trophy girls, and he shot Barbara Roufs more than almost anyone else because she was always there and she always looked good on film. His photographs of her laughing beside dragsters, presenting trophies to legends, interacting with crew members in the pits. These images have become the visual shorthand for what 1970s drag racing looked like. Photographer Steve Reyes, who covered OCIR from its opening in 1967 all the way to its closure in 1983, and who went on to shoot for a dozen major automotive magazines, also captured her extensively. Steve Reyes was meticulous about documentation. He shot everything at OCIR, and he archived everything. And years later, an 8x10 print from his negatives, specifically labeled OCIR PDA Queen Barbara Roufs, appeared on collector auction sites. That print is now considered a piece of drag racing memorabilia worth actual money. Barbara's image circulated everywhere, in branded merchandise, in advertisements, in the racing press, Hot Rod magazine, Drag Racing magazine, Carcraft. These publications ran photos from every major event, and Barbara was in a significant percentage of them. Walk into the pits at OCIR on a Saturday night in 1973, and Barbara Roufs was one of the most recognizable people there. Not just among the trophy girls, among everyone. People knew her name. They looked for her at events. She had achieved something rare in this role, which was individual recognition beyond just being a pretty face in the background. What made her unusual beyond her age was her presence. If you look at vintage footage or photographs from this era, you can see it immediately. Most trophy girls look stiff. They look posed. They look like they are uncomfortable or unsure what to do with their hands. Barbara looks completely natural. She is laughing. She is engaged. She is touching the cars. She is talking to the drivers. She looks like she belongs there. And that authenticity translated to the camera in a way that made her stand out. In an era when most trophy girls were treated as interchangeable props, Barbara Roufs had become a personality. She had become someone the fans actually cared about seeing. But here is what you have to understand about the trophy girl system, and this is critical to understanding what happened next. The entire structure was built on a biological clock that nobody controlled and nobody could extend. Your value in this role was entirely optical, and it expired when you stopped looking the way sponsors wanted you to look. There was no career path, no pension, no health insurance, no institutional support, no union, no way to leverage your visibility into something sustainable once the camera stopped. You were decoration, and decoration goes out of style. The moment you no longer fit the image they wanted, which could happen for any number of reasons, age, weight, pregnancy, injury, or just the simple fact that younger women showed up who fit the current aesthetic better, you were done. And nobody in the industry thought this was a problem, because nobody in the industry thought of trophy girls as people with careers. They thought of them as props. The best way to understand this is to look at the two other trophy girls who became legendary in this era and see what happened to them, because the outcomes tell you everything you need to know about how this system worked.
Linda Vaughn is the most famous trophy girl in motorsports history. She started as Miss Atlanta Raceway in 1961, then became Miss Hurst Golden Shifter, and turned that into a career that lasted 60 years and got her inducted into the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America in 2019. Linda Vaughn is still alive. She still makes appearances at racing events. She's beloved and respected and recognized as a pioneer. But Linda Vaughn is the exception, and she became the exception through extraordinary business acumen that had nothing to do with standing in victory lane looking pretty. Linda Vaughn understood very early that she was selling a brand, not just herself. She made formal presentations to the Hearst Board of Directors, pitching promotional strategies. She personally sold Ford executives on the shifter concept. She negotiated her own contracts. She built relationships with sponsors that extended beyond just showing up and smiling. She turned herself into a businesswoman who happened to be beautiful, rather than a beautiful woman who happened to be in business. And even with all that, even with her being the first lady of motorsports, even with her Hall of Fame induction, Hot Rod magazine said it plainly in a retrospective article. Racing queens tend to go out of style faster than yesterday's hot trick setup, and that's racing. Miss Linda Vaughn, the most obvious exception to the rule, began to get the picture early. That sentence tells you everything. Linda Vaughn survived because she got the picture early. She understood the game. She understood that her looks would fade and her value would disappear unless she built something more substantial underneath. And she did. But the article makes it clear she was the exception. The rule was obsolescence. Jungle Pam Hardy offers maybe the closest comparison to Barbara Roufs. Pam Hardy was 18 years old in 1973 when she started dating Jungle Jim Lieberman, the wildly popular funny car driver. Jim hired her as his backing-up girl, which meant she would guide him back to the starting line after his burnouts. Now this sounds like a simple technical job, but Jim turned it into theater. Pam would wear braless tank tops and the shortest shorts legally allowed, and when Jim finished his smoky, tire-shredding burnout, she would walk out into the smoke and guide this fire-breathing funny car backwards while the crowd lost their minds. She became as big a draw as Jim was. People showed up to watch Jungle Pam as much as they showed up to watch Jungle Jim. Her image appeared on posters, on t-shirts, in magazines everywhere. For 4 years, from 1973 to 1977, Jungle Pam Hardy was one of the most famous women in drag racing. But here is the thing. When Jungle Jim Lieberman died in a street crash on September 9, 1977, after he lost control of his Corvette on a public road and hit a bus, Pam Hardy's career ended instantly that very day. She never worked with another driver. She never sought out another ride. She later described the partnership as a flash in the pan, a bolt of lightning. She married twice, lived quietly, worked normal jobs, raised a family, and only re-emerged for occasional nostalgia appearances at car shows decades later. She has been very clear in interviews that she has no regrets, but also very clear that the Jungle Pam era was a specific moment in time, attached to a specific person, and when that person died, the era ended. The machinery that had made her famous had no use for her once the man she was attached to was gone. Nobody offered her another gig. Nobody tried to build a brand around her independently. She was Jungle Jim's girl, and when Jungle Jim died, she became nobody. So you had Linda Vaughn, who survived by becoming a businesswoman. You had Jungle Pam, who survived by retreating into a quiet private life. And you had hundreds of other trophy girls whose names nobody remembers because the system used them up and moved on. Girls who did this for a year or two, got some pictures taken, got to party with racers, got to feel famous, and then aged out or got pregnant or gained weight or just stopped fitting the look and disappeared completely. The industry did not track them, the sport did not honor them, the culture did not care what happened to them after they stopped being useful. Barbara Roufs was entering this world in her late 20s, which meant her window was even shorter than most. She was already older than the average trophy girl when she became PDA queen. She had maybe 3 or 4 years before the biological clock ran out and the sponsors started looking for younger faces. And nothing about the culture suggested anyone was thinking about what happened to these women after the cameras stopped. The assumption was that they would get married, settle down, have kids, and be happy with the memories of their brief moment in the spotlight. That was the fairy tale. The reality was usually much darker. By the mid-1970s, Barbara Roufs' career as a trophy girl appears to have ended. The exact timeline is unclear because there is no documentation, but somewhere around 1975 or 1976, the photographs stop appearing, the public mentions stop, the magazine features stop. She is no longer listed as PDA queen in event programs. She's no longer in the Victory Lane photos. She is just gone. And what follows is a 15-year void. Between roughly 1975 and January 1991, there is almost no public record of Barbara Roufs' life. We know she was living in Fresno, California, back in the Central Valley where she had grown up, 200 miles from the OCIR grandstands. We know her mother, Thelma, still ran her beauty salon in Clovis and was active in local churches. We know her siblings lived in the region. But what Barbara was doing, how she was supporting herself, what her emotional state was, whether she struggled financially or emotionally, whether she had relationships, whether she tried to build a new career, whether she missed the racing world or was happy to be away from it, none of that is documented anywhere. There are no interviews, no public appearances, no mentions in local newspapers. She did not show up at racing reunions or nostalgia events. She completely disappeared from public life. And while Barbara was living those undocumented years, what was happening to the world she had inhabited was systematic destruction.
Lions Drag Strip, the legendary Wilmington venue known as The Beach, was the first major track to fall. Lions had opened way back in 1955, and it had become holy ground for Southern California hot rodders. This was where the sport was born. This was where the legends made their names. Mickey Thompson raced at Lions. Don Garlits raced at Lions. Every innovation, every breakthrough, every record that mattered in West Coast drag racing happened at Lions, or was proven at Lions. The track was located on land leased from the Port of Los Angeles, and for years that arrangement worked fine. But by the early 1970s, the shipping industry was booming, and the port needed more space for container facilities. They started pressuring Lions to shut down, citing noise complaints from nearby residents. On December 2, 1972, the LA Harbor Commission formally revoked the track's lease, and Lions Drag Strip held its final event. Over 20,000 people showed up that night. The parking lots were full hours before the first race. People were parking on the street for miles. The crowd was so massive that fans started tearing down sections of fence just to get inside. They wanted to be there for the end. They wanted to witness the last race at Lions. The final event ran late into the night, and when it was over, the fans stormed the track. They took pieces of the guardrails. They took pieces of the timing equipment. They took dirt from the racing surface as souvenirs. The scene was later described as the Woodstock of drag racing, and that is not an exaggeration. This was a cultural moment. This was the death of something that mattered deeply to tens of thousands of people. Larry Sutton, the chief starter who had worked Lions for years, said losing Lions was totally an emotional deal for me because that's where I grew up. And he meant that literally. He had spent his entire adult life at that track. It was where he learned his craft, where he made his friends, where he built his identity. And now it was gone, bulldozed within weeks to make room for shipping containers. But Lions was just the beginning. Over the next decade, Southern California drag strips fell one after another like dominoes. Irondale Raceway closed in 1977. San Fernando drag strip, gone. San Gabriel drag strip, gone. Fontana, gone. Riverside, Goleta, Colton, Paradise Mesa, Ramona, Santa Ana. One by one, the tracks that had defined Southern California car culture were bulldozed for commercial development. The land was too valuable. The noise complaints were too loud. The political will to preserve these places did not exist, and so they disappeared. And then, in 1983, the crown jewel fell. Orange County International Raceway, Barbara Roufs' home track, the most modern drag facility in America, closed on October 30th, 1983, when the Irvine Company reclaimed the land. The final event drew massive crowds. People knew they were watching the end of an era. They knew this was the last time they would ever see racing at this facility. The atmosphere was celebration mixed with mourning. When the last car made its final pass down the OCIR quarter mile, the crowd stood and applauded for minutes. And then it was over. NHRA historian Phil Burgess cataloged the devastation in an article years later. Santa Ana, San Fernando, Goleta, Colton, Riverside, Ramona, Paradise Mesa, San Gabriel, Fontana, Lions, Irondale, OCIR. Gone, gone, gone. His litany reads like a eulogy. For the first time in 30 years, Southern California, the birthplace of hot rodding, the place where this entire culture started, had no full-time drag strip in operation. If you wanted to see drag racing in the mid-1980s in Southern California, you had to drive to Pomona for NHRA national events, or you had to leave the state entirely. The grassroots weekend racing scene that had sustained the culture was completely dead. Now think about what this meant for someone like Barbara Roufs. The physical stages where she had existed as a public figure were literally bulldozed and turned into shopping centers and office parks. The community that had gathered at those stages scattered to the winds. The culture shifted toward corporate sponsorship and regulation and television coverage. The role of the trophy girl shrank and professionalized. The wild, spontaneous, chaotic energy that had defined 1970s drag racing was gone, replaced by something cleaner, more controlled, more respectable, and infinitely less fun. And if your identity had been forged in that world, if the happiest days of your life had been standing in victory lane at OCIR, handing trophies to legends, if your sense of self-worth had been built on being recognized and celebrated and photographed and wanted, then watching that world get erased from the map was not just nostalgic loss, it was existential. The world that had made you who you were no longer existed. The people who had known you had moved on. The places where you had mattered were parking lots. The trophy girl system had always been exploitative, but it was exploitation with a payoff. You got fame, you got access, you got to be at the center of something huge and exciting and dangerous. You got to feel important, even if that importance was artificial and temporary. For a few years, you got to matter. And then, one day, it ended. The phone stopped ringing. The photographers stopped calling. You aged out, or the culture moved on, or the tracks closed, and you were expected to just step aside and live the rest of your life as if those years had never happened, as if the version of yourself that had stood in victory lane, smiling for the cameras, was someone else entirely.
Barbara Roufs lived 15 years after her trophy girl career ended. 15 years in Fresno, 200 miles from the nearest drag strip. 15 years with no public record, no interviews, no mentions, no appearances. 15 years that her own daughter later described as short-lived when talking about her mother's happy and exciting life. The implication is unavoidable. The best years, the ones that mattered, the ones that felt real, were the ones on camera. Everything after was just time passing. We do not know what those 15 years looked like for Barbara. We do not know if she worked a regular job or if she struggled financially. We do not know if she had relationships or if she was lonely. We do not know if she tried to stay connected to the racing world or if she deliberately walked away from it. We do not know if she looked back on her trophy girl years with pride or regret or some complicated mixture of both. We do not know if she talked about that time in her life or if she kept it private. All we know is that on January 25, 1991, Barbara Roufs decided she did not want to be here anymore. She died by suicide. She was 47 years old. Her death certificate, indexed in the California Death Index, lists Fresno County. She was buried at Clovis Cemetery, near her family, near the small city where she had been born 47 years earlier. And the drag racing community, the world that had put her image on posters and in magazines and in advertisements, did not mark her passing. No magazine ran an obituary, no track held a moment of silence, no racing organization issued a statement. The culture that had celebrated Barbara Roufs when she was young and beautiful and useful simply did not notice she was gone. For 25 years, her cause of death was not public knowledge. It remained private within her family, as it should have. Her mother, Thelma, died in 2005 in Fresno, and her obituary mentioned her surviving daughter Barbara, without any indication that Barbara had already been gone for 14 years. And then, in 2016, Tom West posted those vintage photographs, and everything changed. Tom West had been going through his archives, digitizing old negatives from his decades of shooting drag racing, and he came across his collection of Barbara Roufs photos. He posted them to a classic car forum to share what he considered iconic images from the golden age of Southern California racing. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People who had been at OCIR in the 1970s started commenting about how much they remembered her. People who collected vintage drag racing memorabilia started asking if prints were available. The thread grew to hundreds of comments within days. And then Barbara's daughter, Jet Doherty, saw the thread. Think about what that moment must have been like for her. She is scrolling through a classic car forum, and suddenly there is her mother. Not the mother she knew, not the woman who raised her, but this other version, this Barbara Roufs who existed in these photographs as someone radiant and confident and celebrated. Someone standing beside top fuel dragsters, laughing with famous drivers, presenting trophies at the biggest races in America. Someone who looked like she was exactly where she wanted to be, doing exactly what she wanted to do. Jet commented publicly on the thread, and what she said matters because it is the only family testimony on record about Barbara's life and death. She thanked Tom West for posting the photos. She said her mother would have been proud to see them because they depicted her best moments in life and her happiest days. She said her mother had lived a happy and exciting life that was short-lived. She confirmed that her mother had died by suicide, but said the reason was not apparent, which suggests that even her own daughter did not fully understand why. She expressed pride in her mother's legacy, and then she disappeared back into privacy, as was her right. Barbara's granddaughter, Crystal Doherty, also commented, expressing pride and noting a physical resemblance to the grandmother she appears never to have met. The family's engagement with the thread was brief and respectful, and then they were gone. They had answered the question about what happened to Barbara Roufs, and the answer was that she had died quietly 25 years ago, and nobody in the drag racing world had noticed. What Jet said about those photographs showing her mother's best moments and happiest days is the most devastating detail in this entire story. Because if that is true, if the best and happiest days of Barbara Roufs' 47 years of life were the ones she spent in short shorts and go-go boots, handing trophies to strangers at a racetrack, then what does that tell us about the rest of her life? What does that tell us about the years after the camera stopped? What does that tell us about the distance between the woman in those photographs and the woman who raised a daughter in Fresno and died alone at 47? It tells us that two Barbara Roufs existed. The one who lived in those photographs, frozen in her late 20s, forever young, forever smiling, forever celebrated. And the one who lived 47 years, who raised a daughter, who survived 15 years after the spotlight went dark, and who died in a way that suggests those years were not happy or exciting or fulfilling.
The distance between those two women is the real story. And it is a story that no amount of research can fully close because the evidence does not exist. Barbara Roufs left behind hundreds of photographs and almost nothing else. No interviews where she talks about her experiences, no memoir where she reflects on her life, no public statements about what it felt like to be famous or what it felt like when fame ended. Just images and silence. In the years since 2016, her photographs have been shared thousands of times across social media. Instagram accounts dedicated to 1970s drag racing aesthetics post her pictures regularly. Pinterest boards collect her images. Facebook groups devoted to Southern California car culture share Tom West and Steve Ray's photos of her. The comments are always the same.
People talk about how beautiful she was, how iconic, how she defined an era. And all of that is true. She did define an era, but the era did not define her in return. It used her and moved on. And when she needed it to remember her, to care about what happened to her after the cameras stopped, it was gone. Now here is where the story gets even stranger and more disturbing. After Tom West posted those photographs in 2016 and Barbara's family confirmed her death, dozens of websites picked up the story. But instead of treating it with accuracy and respect, most of these sites fabricated details out of thin air. One site claimed Barbara was a professional race car driver who broke the 6-second barrier in top fuel, which is completely false. Another called her an LGBTQ pioneer, despite zero evidence of this. Several sites asserted her net worth was $1.5 million, a number pulled from nowhere. Sites claimed she died of a drug overdose or cancer or a car accident. They invented relationships with famous drivers. They made up quotes. They created an entire fictional biography. None of these claims have any basis in evidence. The real Barbara Roufs, a motorcycle racer's daughter from Clovis who became PDA queen and died in Fresno, was buried under a layer of algorithmically generated noise. Her actual story, which is quieter and more human and more tragic than any of the invented versions, became almost impossible to find unless you knew how to track down primary sources like genealogical records and cemetery databases. She is sometimes called the Holy Grail of trophy girls now. Her vintage photographs circulate constantly. Her image continues to generate cultural and even commercial value she never captured. Tom West and Steve Ray's photos of her are sold as prints. She appears on nostalgia Instagram accounts that have tens of thousands of followers. Her face is recognizable to people who were not even born when she died. But there is no Wikipedia article about her, no documentary, no magazine retrospective, no institutional recognition. The gap between her visual ubiquity and her biographical invisibility is the defining feature of her legacy. We know what she looked like. We have no idea who she was. What the case of Barbara Roufs illuminates with absolute clarity is the asymmetry at the heart of 1970s drag racing culture. The men who raced, Prudhomme, McEwen, Garlitz, Bernstein, built careers that lasted decades and earned institutional recognition. Don Garlitz is in the Motorsports Hall of Fame. So is Linda Vaughn. But Linda Vaughn made herself a businesswoman who happened to be beautiful, rather than a beautiful woman who happened to work in racing. The women who stood in victory lane beside the drivers, the ones who posed for the photos, the ones who added the cheesecake, were treated as seasonal decorations, replaceable, disposable, temporary. Some survived by evolving, like Linda. Some survived by retreating, like Pam. Barbara Roufs did not survive, and we will never know exactly why, because she left no record of her internal life, but we can understand the structural forces that made survival difficult. The machinery that created her fame had no mechanism for sustaining her once her optical value expired. The culture that profited from her image had no interest in her well-being as a human being. The tracks where she had been celebrated were bulldozed. The photographers moved on to younger women. The sponsors found new faces. The racing organizations crowned new queens. And Barbara went back to Fresno and lived 15 years that left almost no trace in the public record. And then she died. The trophy girl system was built to extract value from women's youth and discard them when that value depreciated. It was not designed to support them afterward. It was not designed to care about them as people. It was designed to use them as props and then forget them. And it worked exactly as designed. The drag racing community today is very different from what it was in the 1970s. It is more corporate, more regulated, more professional. Women work in the sport now, as drivers, as crew chiefs, as team owners, as executives. Brittany Force drives Top Fuel. Leah Prudhomme runs Don Prudhomme Racing. Women have actual careers in this sport now, with actual pathways to success that do not depend entirely on their appearance. The trophy girl role still exists, but it is smaller, more controlled, more conscious of its own history and its own problems.
And when people in the sport talk about the golden age of Southern California drag racing, they talk about Lions and OCIR and the legends who raced there. They talk about the Snake and the Mongoose. They talk about the PDA and Doug Cruz. They talk about the innovations and the speeds and the crowds. They do not talk about the women who stood in victory lane. Those women were scenery, background, decoration. They were part of the aesthetic, but not part of the story. Barbara Roufs was not scenery. She was a person. She was a daughter,
a mother, a woman who lived 47 years and spent a few of them at the center of something that felt enormous, and the rest of them somewhere else, doing something we will never know. And when she died, the only people who mourned her were the ones who knew her as a person, not as an image. Her family buried her, her friends, if she had friends, attended her funeral, and the drag racing world, the world that had made her famous for those few years, did not notice she was gone until 25 years later when a photographer posted some old photos to the internet. There is no moral to this story that is not obvious. Fame built entirely on appearance has an expiration date that biology enforces and culture accelerates. Systems that treat people as decorative objects discard them when their decorative value expires. Cultures that celebrate individuals intensely for a few years and then forget them completely are not actually celebrating the individuals. They are celebrating themselves and their own ability to create spectacle. And when those individuals die in silence, it is because the culture never cared about them in the first place. Barbara Roufs died on January 25, 1991, in Fresno, California, at the age of 47. The drag racing world found out in January 2016 when her daughter confirmed it in a forum comment. That 25-year gap between her death and the sport's awareness of her death tells you everything you need to know about what her fame was worth when it actually mattered. It was worth nothing. It was worth less than nothing because it created an identity she could not sustain, and a life she could not return to, and a version of herself she could never be again. Her daughter said the photographs showed her mother's best moments in life and her happiest days. And if that is true, if the best and happiest days of Barbara Roufs' life were the ones she spent handing trophies to strangers at a racetrack that no longer exists, then the question we should be asking is not what happened to Barbara Roufs after the cameras stopped. The question is, what kind of culture creates a situation where a woman's happiest days are the ones where she is being used as decoration? The answer is the culture we are looking at, the one that built stadiums for machines and put women in short shorts to make the photographs look better, the one that paid drivers millions and gave trophy girls $50 and called it an opportunity, the one that remembered every 8th mile pass and forgot every woman who stood in victory lane the moment she stopped fitting the aesthetic, the one that treated human beings as props and then acted surprised when those props had internal lives and emotional needs and futures that extended beyond their usefulness to the spectacle. That culture killed Barbara Roufs as surely as if it had pulled the trigger itself. It gave her a few years of happiness and visibility and purpose, and then it took all of that away and left her with nothing. No career, no skills that translated to the real world, no support system, no institutional framework to help her transition to life after fame. Just memories of a time when she mattered and a present where she did not. And that is the story of Barbara Roufs, a motorcycle racer's daughter from Clovis who became one of the most photographed women in drag racing history and died in silence 25 years before anyone in the sport noticed her death. The photographs remain. They circulate constantly now, more than they did when she was alive. People collect them, trade them, share them on social media. They say she was iconic. They say she defined an era. They say she was beautiful. All of that is true, but none of it saved her. None of it mattered when the lights went out and the tracks closed and the cameras moved on and she went back to Fresno to live the rest of her life as someone the culture had used up and discarded. The cost of that fame was 47 years, a few of them in the spotlight, 15 of them in silence, and a death that nobody noticed until a photographer posted some old pictures to the internet and her daughter had to explain to strangers what had happened to the woman in the photos. Wherever Barbara Roufs is now, she is not handing out trophies. She is not posing for photographs. She is not standing in victory lane, smiling for cameras that only cared about her when she looked a certain way. She is gone, and the culture that made her famous never even said goodbye.